That piece of salmon nigiri you had for lunch? It wasn't invented in Japan. It wasn't invented by a sushi chef at all. It was invented by a Norwegian salmon farmer trying to solve a surplus problem in the 1980s. And that's just the first crack in everything you think you know about this dish. Sushi. The word alone conjures centuries of unbroken Japanese tradition, a sacred, ancient art passed from master to apprentice in Tokyo back alleys since time immemorial. That's the story sushi sells about itself. But sushi wasn't invented as a delicacy at all. It was invented as trash management, a preservation hack from a part of the world that isn't Japan. And the traditional hand-pressed sushi you picture is barely 200 years old. By the end of this video, you'll understand the real chain of accidents. A fermentation trick from Southeast Asian river villages, a street vendor in Edo solving a lunch rush problem, an earthquake, and a Norwegian trade delegation that built the dish sitting on your plate. This comes from food historians like Eric Rath at the University of Kansas and researchers who've traced sushi's paper trail back through Chinese dictionaries nearly 2,000 years old. Start with the myth everyone believes. Sushi is Japanese, full stop. Here's the first fracture. The earliest ancestor of sushi wasn't cooked in Japan at all. It was cooked, or rather fermented, along the Mekong River basin in what is now Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and Vietnam, sometime around the 2nd century AD. Villages there packed gutted freshwater fish into rice, salt, and weighted stone barrels, sealing them for months so lactic acid bacteria could do the preserving. The rice was not food, it was packaging, discarded once the fish inside had cured. Picture a barrel buried in a riverbank hut, sour and pungent enough that neighbors would know exactly what was fermenting inside without opening the lid. That technique migrated north with Han Chinese settlers who adopted it from the Bayou peoples of southern China. And from there it crossed into Japan alongside wet rice farming during the Yohei period. So the most Japanese food in the world started as a Southeast Asian solution to a problem Japan did not even have yet. What do you do with fish in a country without refrigeration? That fermentation obsession explains why Japan calls this ancestor narazushi, still made today in Shiga Prefecture with carp from Lake Biwa. But the reason sushi eventually abandoned fermentation completely, the reason it became fast instead of slow, is a story about impatience, and it is about to get a lot stranger. Here's the fact that upends the whole ancient tradition premise. Salmon nigiri, arguably the most ordered sushi on Earth, has almost nothing to do with Japanese culinary history. Traditional Edo-style sushi never used salmon raw because Pacific salmon carries parasites that make it dangerous eaten uncooked, so chefs served it grilled, salted, or not at all. Therefore, salmon sushi didn't exist in Japan until Norway needed somewhere to dump an aquaculture surplus. In the 1970s and the 1980s, Norwegian fish farmers had figured out how to raise Atlantic salmon in ocean net pens, and they'd gotten too good at it, producing fattier fish, parasite-free because it never touched the open sea floor, and far more of it than Norway's own population could eat. A Norwegian trade official named Thor Listau launched what was literally codenamed Project Japan, flying delegations of ministers and seafood executives to Tokyo with coolers of raw Atlantic salmon, trying to convince chefs who had spent careers rejecting the fish that this salmon was different. It took nearly a decade of tastings, name changes, rebranding it as salmon to separate it from cheap domestic salmon, and one 1992 bulk sale of 5,000 metric tons to a Japanese distributor before the fish caught on. Disputed, some industry accounts credit different individual executives with the breakthrough moment, but the Norwegian marketing origin itself is well documented. That alone should make you look at your next sushi platter differently. But the story of how sushi became fast food in the first place, centuries earlier, is even less romantic than a marketing campaign. It's a guy trying to beat the lunch rush. Rewind to 1824, in the Ryogoku district of Edo, the city that would later become Tokyo. A restaurateur named Hanaya Yohei ran a yatai, a mobile street stall, positioned deliberately by one of the only bridges crossing the Sumida River, where foot traffic never stopped. Fermentation took months. Yohei's customers wanted lunch in minutes. Therefore, he threw out the entire preservation process. He mixed rice vinegar and salt into freshly steamed rice, let it sit only long enough to season, then hand-pressed it into an oblong shape and laid a slice of fish, caught that same morning in Tokyo Bay, directly on top. No fermenting, no waiting, just rice, fish, and a transaction that took seconds. Historians now believe Yohei probably wasn't the sole inventor so much as its best promoter, but he's the name that stuck, and what he was selling, nigiri sushi, was 3 times larger than the bite you'd order today, and used a completely different, sweeter red vinegar made from fermented sake leaves. Sushi went from something you buried in a jar to something you ate standing up between errands. That one shift from preservation to speed explains why sushi could later survive being flung across an entire country by catastrophe, because a disaster was coming and it would do more to spread this dish than any chef ever could. September 1923. The Great Kanto Earthquake tore through Tokyo and Yokohama, killing over 100,000 people and flattening roughly 60% of Tokyo's buildings. But out of that devastation came an unintended consequence for sushi. Land prices in the city collapsed and displaced Edo sushi vendors, no longer able to afford their old stalls, scattered to their home provinces across Japan, taking Edo-style nigiri with them into regions that had never seen it. What had been a hyper-local Tokyo street food became a national one almost by accident of geography and grief. Therefore, within a generation, nigiri wasn't Tokyo sushi anymore. It was just sushi. Decades later, after American occupation authorities banned Japan's street food stalls following World War II, sushi moved indoors into proper restaurants and briefly became more formal, more expensive, further from its fast food roots. But in 1958, an Osaka restaurant owner named Yoshiaki Shiraishi, unable to afford enough staff, watched beer bottles gliding along a conveyor belt at an Asahi brewery and spent 5 years engineering a version for sushi plates instead. His restaurant, Mawaru Genroku, put sushi back on a belt, back within reach of ordinary customers, and back to its origins as something meant to move fast. Sushi had now been uninvented and reinvented twice. First by Yohei, then by an earthquake, then by a brewery tour. But its strangest reinvention was still an ocean away, waiting in a Los Angeles strip mall. By the 1960s, sushi had crossed the Pacific with Japanese immigrant communities, but it stayed inside those communities for decades. Most Americans would not touch raw fish. Therefore, at a little Tokyo restaurant called Tokyo Kaikon, chefs experimenting to win over unfamiliar customers began substituting fatty tuna with avocado and hiding the seaweed inside the roll instead of outside, since American diners kept peeling the nori off before eating. Whoever built it first, the effect was the same. A roll with no raw fish, no visible seaweed, and no resemblance to Edo-me tradition became the doorway through which an entire cuisine entered the West. So trace the whole chain back. A preservation trick from Mekong River villages becomes a Japanese staple. A street vendor strips out the fermentation to sell lunch faster. An earthquake scatters his invention nationwide. A Norwegian marketing campaign adds a fish that was never traditionally eaten raw in the first place. And an avocado stand-in in a Los Angeles strip mall becomes most of the world's introduction to Japanese food. Sushi isn't one country's unbroken heritage. It's a 2,000-year relay race of accidents, disasters, and marketing campaigns, each one erasing what came before it while insisting it was tradition all along. So next time someone tells you they're eating authentic sushi, ask them which century they mean, because the dish has reinvented itself completely, more times than anyone ordering it tonight will ever know.